I never wanted to step foot on that property. 8 months had passed since Colton and Carrie ended things, 8 months since my son had driven away from her apartment building, with his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. But there I stood on a Saturday afternoon in late September, the Texas sun bearing down on my shoulders like a judgment I hadn't asked for, staring at a wrought iron gate that probably cost more than my truck. The Ashford estate sprawled across 3 acres of prime Westlake Hills, real estate, the kind of address that made insurance agents salivate, and ordinary folks like me feel the weight of every callus on our palms. I counted at least 6 dormers on the main house limestone walls that gleamed white against manicured hedges, in a circular driveway paved with something that definitely wasn't standard asphalt. The whole place screamed old money, the kind that whispers instead of shouts because it doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Colt shifted beside me, his work boots looking as out of place on this pristine pavement as a coyote at a garden party. My boy had inherited my build broad shoulders from years of honest labor hands that knew the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead before he could recite the alphabet. 26 years old and already one of the best electricians in Austin, not that Carrie's family had ever bothered to acknowledge it. My father's voice echoed in my memory the way it always did when I found myself in situations that tested my patience. Warren Thornton had spent 40 years building furniture and restoring homes across hill country, and he'd passed down more than just his tools when cancer took him 3 years back. A man gets measured by how he stands with his family when nobody's asking him to, he used to say, usually while sanding down some piece of oak that would outlast us all. And he never said anything he didn't mean. The gate buzzed open without us pressing any intercom, which meant someone had been watching. Cameras probably hidden in those decorative stone pillars like mechanical spies. I resisted the urge to wave. We walked up the driveway in silence, our footsteps crunching against whatever exotic gravel the Ashfords had imported from wherever rich people imported gravel from. Colt's jaw was doing that thing again, the muscle jumping near his ear like a warning signal. I wanted to tell him we could turn around, that no box of leftover belongings was worth this particular brand of humiliation, but he'd asked me to come, and that was enough. The front door opened before we reached the porch step. A woman in her early 60s stood there, silver hair, pulled back in a practical bun, her posture suggesting she'd spent decades navigating the peculiar demands of wealthy households. Something in her eyes struck me as unexpectedly warm, a contrast to the cold grandeur surrounding her. Dorothy Palmer, she introduced herself, though her tone made it clear introductions were a formality she'd long since grown tired of. Mrs. Ashford asked me to show you to the garden. Miss Carrie will meet you there. The garden. Of course they had a garden. Probably had a hedge maze and a tennis court too, maybe a small vineyard for weekends when regular wine just wouldn't do. We followed Dorothy through a foyer that could have housed my entire living room twice over. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings high enough to give a man vertigo, and oil paintings lined the walls like windows into some alternate universe, where everyone wore uncomfortable clothes and never smiled. My work boots felt heavier, with each step leaving faint traces of hill country dust on floors that had probably never seen anything more offensive than imported Italian leather. The back garden stretched toward a horizon I couldn't quite see. Rolling lawns giving way to clusters of ornamental trees and what looked like a professional-grade swimming pool glinting turquoise in the afternoon light. Somewhere nearby, water trickled from a fountain that probably cost more than my mortgage. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and money, that peculiar blend of floral perfume and quiet arrogance that seemed to seep from every manicured bush. Dorothy gestured toward a stone bench near a sprawling cluster of lavender before disappearing back into the house. The purple flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their scent cutting through the afternoon heat with something almost medicinal. I'd always liked lavender. Linda used to grow it in our backyard back when our backyard still meant something, back when she was still alive to tend it, 7 years. 7 years since cancer had stolen my wife, had carved out a piece of my chest that no amount of sawdust or sweat could ever fill. I'd spent most of those years moving through life like a man underwater, going through the motions of living without ever quite surfacing for air. Colt had kept me anchored, his presence a reminder that some parts of Linda still walked this earth, still needed me to show up, even when showing up felt like the hardest thing in the world. I sat on the bench while Colt paced nearby, his restless energy practically vibrating off him. The boy had never been good at waiting, a trait he'd definitely inherited from his mother. Linda used to joke that patience was the one virtue our family had collectively decided to skip, and she wasn't wrong. His phone buzzed and he stepped away to answer it. I could tell from his posture that it was work, something about a project he'd been wrestling with for the past week. A commercial building downtown, tricky wiring situation that the original contractors had botched beyond recognition. Colt had been called in to fix their mistakes the way he was always being called in to fix other people's mistakes. His voice carried across the garden as he explained something technical, something about load calculations and circuit breakers that would have made my father proud. Warren Thornton had believed in understanding the bones of things, the hidden structures that held everything together. A good craftsman doesn't just know how he used to say, he knows why, and he can explain it to someone who doesn't know either. I watched my son gesture with his free hand, his explanations precise and patient, breaking down complex concepts into language his colleague could actually use. Pride swelled in my chest, that particular kind of pride that comes from watching your child become something better than you'd ever imagined. Colt hadn't gone to college, a decision that had apparently been unforgivable in Carrie Ashford's eyes, but he'd built something real with his hands and his mind. At 26, he was already saving for his own business, already training younger guys who looked up to him the way I'd once looked up to my father. When he hung up, I couldn't help myself. That was good. Clear explanations. Your grandfather would have been proud. Colt's mouth twitched towards something like a smile. Learn from the best. And that's when I heard it. A voice soft as the lavender-scented breeze, carrying words clearly not meant for anyone's ears, but the speaker's own. The sound came from somewhere beyond the nearest hedge, close enough to make out, but distant enough to suggest privacy that wasn't quite as private as intended. I wish I had a man who talked to his son like that, who looked at his child with eyes like that. My body went still, every muscle freezing in place like I'd suddenly forgotten how movement worked. The voice belonged to a woman, her tone carrying something heavier than simple observation. There was longing in those words, the kind of longing that builds up over years of silence and finally escapes when no one's supposed to be listening. Through a gap in the lavender bushes, I could see her standing alone near the pool. Mid-50s, maybe older, with dark auburn hair cut short in a style that managed to look both practical and expensive. She wore a simple dress in navy blue, the kind of simple that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she held herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd spent decades learning how to look perfect while feeling anything but. Her eyes were fixed on the space where Colt and I had been talking, but her gaze seemed to pass right through us towards something only she could see. The expression on her face made my chest tighten. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in my own mirror during those first years after Linda, that particular blend of emptiness and yearning that comes from being surrounded by everything except the one thing you actually need. Then she turned and our eyes met through the lavender. The transformation was instantaneous. Whatever vulnerability had been showing on her face vanished behind a mask so complete it might as well have been carved from the same limestone as her house. Her spine straightened another impossible inch. Her chin lifted. Her eyes, which had held something almost human just seconds before, went flat and cold as winter granite. She held my gaze for one long moment, her expression daring me to acknowledge what I'd heard. I held it right back, not out of challenge, but out of something I couldn't quite name. Then she turned and walked toward the house, her heels clicking against the stone pathway, with the precision of a metronome, leaving nothing behind but the fading scent of expensive perfume and a question I had no business asking. Colt appeared at my shoulder. Dad, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I shook my head, forcing my attention back to the present moment, to the reason we were actually here. Just thinking about your mother's garden. This place has a lot of lavender. It wasn't entirely a lie. Linda had loved lavender, had planted entire rows of it along our back fence until the whole yard smelled like a meditation retreat every summer. After she died, I'd let it all go wild for a while, unable to tend something that reminded me so viscerally of her presence. Eventually, I'd ripped most of it out and planted vegetables instead. Practical, useful, less likely to make me cry at unexpected moments. The back door opened again, and Dorothy emerged with a young woman trailing behind her. Carrie Ashford looked exactly like she had 8 months ago, polished and professional, in a way that made my son's work clothes seem like a deliberate insult. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her makeup flawless, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who'd been trained from birth to never show weakness. She greeted Colt with a handshake instead of a hug, which told me everything I needed to know about how this interaction was going to go. Colt, Mr. Thornton, thank you for coming. Colt's response was equally formal, equally distant. We just came for the box. Won't take long. I hung back while they sorted through the details, trying not to watch the way Carrie's eyes kept sliding past my son, like he was furniture she'd decided to replace. 2 years they'd been together. 2 years of dinners and holidays in what I'd assume was genuine connection, all of it apparently worthless once she'd decided his lack of formal education outweighed everything else he had to offer. The back door opened again, and the woman from the lavender garden stepped out onto the patio. Carrie's demeanor shifted slightly, a flicker of something almost human crossing her carefully composed features. Mother, this is Colt and his father, Mr. Thornton. They came to pick up some things. Vivian Ashford crossed the patio toward us with the measured grace of someone who'd spent decades learning how to move through hostile territory without showing fear. Up close, she was older than I'd initially guessed. Late 50s, the lines around her eyes suggesting years of expressions carefully suppressed. Her handshake was surprisingly firm, her palm cool and dry against my work-roughened skin. Most people in her position would have offered the kind of limp, reluctant grip that suggested touching the help was beneath them. She didn't. Mr. Thornton. Her voice was different now, controlled and precise, nothing like the raw longing I'd heard by the pool. Carrie mentioned you're a contractor. 30 years in the trade. Learned from my father. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the mask so small I might have imagined it. Self-taught, or did you attend a program? My father was Warren Thornton. He taught me everything. The crack widened just for a moment before sealing itself shut again. Warren Thornton, the man who restored the floors at St. Andrews back in the 80s. Now it was my turn to be surprised. Most people had never heard of my father, let alone specific projects he'd completed decades ago. You know that church I grew up in, that parish? Her eyes had changed, something warmer flickering behind the ice. My mother used to say your father was the last true craftsman in Austin. She said watching him work was like watching someone pray with their hands. The compliment hit me somewhere unexpected, somewhere I'd built walls specifically to protect. My father had been many things, demanding and particular, and sometimes impossible to please, but he'd also been the best man I'd ever known. Hearing a stranger speak of him with such reverence felt like a gift I hadn't earned. He would have appreciated that I managed. He always said the best work was the work that serves something bigger than yourself. Vivian studied me for a long moment, her gaze assessing in a way that made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed. Then she nodded once and turned back toward the house. I watched her go, aware that something had shifted in the air between us, some invisible boundary that had been crossed without either of us quite meaning to cross it. Behind me, Colt and Carrie were finishing their awkward exchange, the box of his belongings now sitting between them like a tombstone for whatever they'd once shared. The drive home was quiet except for the rumble of my truck's engine and the occasional sigh from Colt's side of the cab. Hill country rolled past the windows, limestone cliffs and scrub oak giving way to the sprawl of Austin's southern suburbs. I'd made this drive thousands of times over the past 30 years, knew every curve and pothole like the lines on my own palms, but today the familiar landscape felt different somehow. Charged with something I couldn't name. My phone buzzed. Hank Rawlings, my oldest friend and the best plumber in Travis County, checking in the way he always did when he sensed something was off. Heard you went to the Dragon's Lair today. Hank's voice crackled through the truck's speakers, his Texas drawl thicker than usual, which meant he'd probably been drinking. Dragon's Lair, the Ashford place. Preston Ashford's a piece of work, let me tell you. My company did the plumbing on one of his commercial buildings a few years back. Man fired the previous contractor for asking for a 1-week extension after they hit unexpected foundation issues. Didn't pay them a dime for work already completed. Sued them for breach of contract just to make a point. I filed that information away, adding it to the mental picture I was building of the Ashford family. The husband sounded like exactly the kind of man who would build an $8 million fortress and fill it with people too afraid to tell him the truth about anything. What about the wife? Vivian. Hank made a sound that might have been a laugh. Ice Queen, from what I hear. Runs some charity foundation, shows up at all the right events, never says a word that hasn't been approved by committee. Why you meet her briefly. And I thought about the woman by the pool, the longing in her voice before she'd noticed me watching. Thought about the firmness of her handshake and the unexpected warmth when she'd mentioned my father. She's not what I expected. Hank was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for him. Garrett Thornton, are you telling me you found something interesting in that mausoleum? I'm telling you, she knew my father's work. That's all. Sure it is, his skepticism carried clearly through the phone line. Just be careful. Those people play by different rules than us regular folks. After we hung up, Colt finally broke his silence. That was weird. What was Mrs. Ashford? The way she looked at you. He turned to face me, his expression curious rather than accusatory. And the way you looked at her. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. I don't know what you're talking about, Dad. Colt's voice carried the particular exasperation of a child who'd spent his whole life watching his parent dodge uncomfortable truths. You're a terrible liar. Always have been. Your grandfather used to say the same thing. He always told me lying was a skill I should never bother developing since I'd never be any good at it anyway. So what happened back there? Nothing happened. We talked about your grandfather's work for about 30 seconds. That's all. Colt didn't push further, but I could feel his attention lingering on me like a question he wasn't quite ready to ask. He'd inherited his mother's perception, that uncanny ability to sense when people were holding something back. Linda had always known when I was carrying more than I was sharing, had always found ways to coax the truth out of me without making me feel cornered. I missed her with a ferocity that still caught me off guard sometimes 7 years later. Missed her laugh and her patience and the way she could make any space feel like home just by standing in it. Most days I'd made peace with her absence, had learned to carry the loss like a stone in my pocket that I'd simply gotten used to feeling. But occasionally something would crack me open again, some sight or sound or smell that transported me back to a time when she was still breathing, still mine. Today it was the lavender. Tomorrow it would be something else. The grief never really went away. It just learned to hide better. I pulled into my driveway as the sun was starting its descent toward the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded me why I'd never wanted to live anywhere else. The house was small by most standards, a 2-bedroom place with a wraparound porch that my father and I had built together 25 years ago. Every board and beam held memories, every corner whispered of the life Linda and I had created within these walls. Colt helped me unload the few groceries we'd picked up on the way home, then made his excuses about an early morning job and headed out. I stood on the back porch as his taillights disappeared down the road, a beer sweating in my hand, and a head full of thoughts I didn't know what to do with. The woman's voice kept echoing in my memory. I wish I had a man who talked to his son like that. The raw honesty of it, the aching vulnerability before she'd noticed my presence and locked it all away. I'd spent enough years around enough people to recognize the sound of someone drowning in plain sight, someone going through the motions of a life that had stopped meaning anything a long time ago. What could a woman like Vivian Ashford possibly be missing? She had the house, the husband, the daughter with the prestigious law degree. She had money and status and all the security that came with both. From the outside, her life looked like everything anyone could want. But I'd seen her eyes in that unguarded moment, and they'd looked exactly like mine had for years after Linda. Empty, hungry, lost in a maze with no exit signs. I finished my beer and went inside determined to put the whole strange afternoon out of my mind. Some things weren't meant to be examined too closely, and the inner life of wealthy strangers definitely fell into that category. Whatever Vivian Ashford was dealing with, it had nothing to do with me, and never would. 2 days later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mr. Thornton. The voice was crisp, professional, vaguely familiar. This is Dorothy Palmer from the Ashford residence. Mrs. Ashford has asked me to contact you regarding a potential project. She wondered if you might be available to meet with her tomorrow at her foundation's office downtown. I stood in the middle of a job site in Round Rock, surrounded by half-finished framing and the familiar chaos of construction work or trying to process what I just heard. Mrs. Ashford wants to hire me. She has a restoration project she believes you'd be suited for. Dorothy's tone gave nothing away, but something in the pause before she continued suggested this was unusual territory for her as well. Would 10 o'clock work? I can send you the address. The professional part of my brain was already calculating logistics and rearranging schedules and delegating tasks to make the meeting work. The other part, the part that still remembered the longing in Vivian's voice by the pool, was warning me that this was a door better left closed. The professional part won. It usually did when money was involved. 10 works. I'll be there. The Ashford Foundation occupied a converted warehouse space in one of Austin's rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. The exterior was all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of calculated aesthetic that said, "We have money, but we're also cool about it." A far cry from the limestone fortress in Westlake Hills, though probably no less expensive per square foot. Vivian was waiting in a corner office that looked nothing like I'd expected. No mahogany desk or leather chairs or oil paintings of disapproving ancestors. Just clean lines and natural light, a few plants that looked actually alive, and bookshelves filled with volumes that had clearly been read rather than displayed. She sat behind a simple wooden table that might have been someone's kitchen furniture. In a former life, her posture as rigid as it had been at her home, but her surroundings suggesting depths I hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Thornton." She stood as I entered, extending her hand in that same firm grip I remembered. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." I took the chair across from her, acutely aware of the dust still clinging to my work boots and the contrast between my faded jeans and her perfectly tailored gray suit. Whatever this meeting was about, it already felt like a test I hadn't studied for. "I'll be direct," she said, which I appreciated, even as it made me nervous. "I don't like wasting time, mine or anyone else's. That makes two of us." Something that might have been approval flickered across her face. "Good. Then I'll explain what I need." She outlined the project with the precision of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms and negotiations. A house in Fredericksburg, about 80 miles west of Austin, in the heart of Hill Country. She'd purchased it 10 years ago, but had done nothing with it since. Now she wanted it restored, not renovated in the modern sense, but actually restored to its original 1960s condition. "The house was my childhood home," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "My parents had to sell it when I was 16. I've always intended to bring it back to what it was, but life kept getting in the way. Now I'm ready." Questions stacked up in my mind like lumber, waiting to be sorted. Why now? Why me specifically? Why had she tracked down the son of a craftsman who'd worked on a church floor 40 years ago, when surely she could afford any restoration specialist in the country, instead of asking any of them? I heard myself say something else entirely. "What made your family sell?" A beat of silence. Then, surprising both of us, I think she answered honestly. "My father was a mechanic. He owned a small shop in town, did good work, built a decent reputation. When I was 15, he was under a car that slipped off its jack. Crushed his leg badly enough that he never worked again. The insurance didn't cover nearly enough, and the medical bills kept coming. We sold the house 6 months later." I understood that particular kind of story better than she probably realized. The way one moment of bad luck could unravel an entire lifetime of careful building. The way working people live so close to the edge that any unexpected push could send them tumbling. My own family had danced near that edge more than once, had pulled back through nothing more than stubbornness and grace. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but they were the only ones I had. Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something raw underneath. It was a long time ago, but walking into that house, even empty and falling apart, I still feel like that girl who had to leave everything she knew. I want to make it whole again. I need someone who understands why that matters. And you think I'm that person because of my father. I think you're that person because of how you looked at your son on Saturday." She met my eyes directly, no pretense or calculation visible in her gaze. "I watched you with Colt for about 5 minutes before you noticed me. The pride in your face, the way you listened to him explain his work. That's not something you can fake, Mr. Thornton. That comes from genuinely valuing what your family has built, not just what they have accumulated." The observation landed somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere I'd built walls specifically to protect. She was right, of course. Colt was the best thing I'd ever contributed to this world, better than any cabinet I'd crafted or home I'd restored. Watching him become a man who knew his own worth, who took pride in honest work, who treated people with the respect they deserved regardless of their bank accounts, that was my real legacy. Everything else was just furniture. "I'll need to see the property before I commit to anything," I told her, falling back on professional protocol to steady myself. "Can't give you an honest assessment from photographs." "Of course." She slid a folder across the table. Here's the address and the basic property information. I can meet you there this weekend if that works for your schedule. The folder felt heavier than paper should weighted with implications I wasn't ready to examine. This weekend works. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Why didn't you just have your husband's company handle this? From what I hear, he's got resources I can only dream of. Something complicated moved behind her eyes, because Preston would tear the whole thing down and build something modern and efficient. He doesn't understand why old things matter, why some things deserve to be saved rather than replaced. It wasn't an answer so much as a revelation, a window into a marriage that apparently lacked even basic shared values. I filed it away with everything else I was learning about Vivian Ashford, the growing file of contradictions that made her increasingly difficult to categorize. One more thing, she called as I reached the doorway. I asked around about your work. Everyone I spoke with said the same thing. Garrett Thornton does what he says he'll do. He shows up when he promises. He cares about getting it right more than getting it done fast. Those aren't qualities you find often anymore. I learned them from my father, I said. He believed that a man's word should be as solid as his work. He sounds like someone I would have liked to know. He would have liked your honesty, I replied. He always said the best clients were the ones who could tell you what they actually wanted instead of what they thought they should want. Her smile was small but genuine, the first real one I'd seen from her. Then I'll try to live up to that standard. I thought about that smile the whole drive home, puzzling over it like a piece of wood with an unusual grain. Nothing about this situation made sense. Why would a woman of her means and connections seek out an independent contractor with no fancy credentials? Why would she share personal history with someone she just met? Why would she look at me sometimes like I was the first person who'd actually seen her in years? Questions I had no business asking about a woman I had no business wondering about. Hank called that evening at his radar for interesting developments, apparently working overtime. Heard through the grapevine you've got a meeting with old lady Ashford. She's not old. And how do you already know about that? His laughter crackled through the phone. Son, in this business, everyone knows everything within about 15 minutes. The question is what they do with the knowing. So what's the job restoration project out in Fredericksburg? Old house she wants brought back to original condition. Sounds right up your alley. What's the catch? What makes you think there's a catch? Because nothing involving that family is ever simple. Preston Ashford's got fingers in more pies than a bakery inventory. Whatever his wife is up to, there's going to be angles you can't see from where you're standing. I considered that, weighing it against my own impressions. Maybe she just wants her childhood home fixed up. People get sentimental about that stuff. Maybe. Or maybe she's got reasons she's not sharing. Just keep your eyes open, Garrett. I'm not saying don't take the job. I'm saying know what you're walking into. After we hung up, I spent the evening going through the folder Vivian had given me. The house was a classic hill country German-style limestone walls and metal roof wraparound porch, and oak trees older than Texas statehood. From the photos, it had been empty for years, slowly surrendering to weather and neglect. The kind of project that would take months of careful work, the kind of challenge I'd built my whole career learning to meet. But it was more than that, wasn't it? It was someone's history, someone's childhood, someone's last connection to a life before everything changed. I understood that weight. I carried something similar every time I walked through the house. My father and I had built every time I ran my hands over wood, he'd shaped with the same tools I still used. Some things deserved to be saved. Some memories needed physical form to survive. If Vivian Ashford understood that, then maybe we had more in common than the gulf between our bank accounts suggested. Saturday came with that particular crystalline quality hill country gets in early autumn, the air crisp and clear as spring water, the sky a blue so deep you could drown in it. I made the drive to Fredericksburg with my windows down, letting the wind and the wildflowers and the limestone cliffs remind me why I'd never wanted to live anywhere else. My father had brought me to this town every fall for cider and exploring two Thornton men rambling through a place that felt like history you could touch. Vivian's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, a sensible sedan that looked almost modest compared to what I'd expected. She stood on the property's overgrown lawn, her hair loose around her shoulders, for the first time wearing jeans and a simple white blouse that made her look 10 years younger and infinitely more real. The house behind her was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The bones were good, that classic German limestone construction that had survived 100 Texas summers and would survive 100 more. But the roof sagged in places the porch boards had rotted through, and the windows stared out like empty eyes in a face that had forgotten how to smile. "It's worse than I remembered," Vivian said as I approached. "Every time I come here, there's something else that's failed. Buildings are like people that way. They need attention to stay healthy. Neglect takes its toll." She turned to look at me, something unguarded in her expression. "That's a sad way of seeing it, sad but true. My father used to say that every structure has a heartbeat. Wood expands and contracts with the seasons. Foundations settle, roofs breathe. When you stop listening to a house, it stops talking to you. Then one day you look up and it's dying and you wonder how you missed all the signs." We walked through the property together, my professional eye cataloging damage, while my mind wandered through the implications of everything I was seeing. The infrastructure was shot wiring and plumbing, both from an era when safety codes were more suggestion than requirement. The floors were original, wide plank, pine warped and water stained, but potentially salvageable. The limestone walls were solid, thank God, which meant the skeleton was worth saving, even if everything else needed replacement. Vivian followed me through every room, asking questions that revealed an understanding of construction I hadn't expected. When I commented on it, she laughed, the sound surprising both of us. "I studied civil engineering in college, graduated near the top of my class." I stopped in the middle of what had once been a kitchen, staring at her. "You're an engineer?" Was a long time ago. Her smile carried something bitter at its edges. "Preston didn't think it was appropriate for his wife to work. And then Carrie came along, and there was always something else that needed my attention, and somehow 30 years went by." The confession hung between us like smoke, revealing more than she'd probably intended. I thought about everything that represented a woman with talent and training and ambition, slowly erased by circumstance and expectation until she'd forgotten she'd ever been anything other than Mrs. Preston Ashford. "That's a loss, for you and for everyone who would have benefited from your work." She looked at me strangely, like I'd said something in a language she'd stopped expecting to hear. "Most people just tell me how lucky I am. The house, the foundation, work, the comfortable life. They don't see the car. Most people only see what they're looking for." I turned back to the damaged kitchen cabinets, running my hand along wood that had once been someone's pride. "My father taught me that the most important part of any structure is the part you can't see. The foundations, the framing, the connections that hold everything together. Pretty surfaces over rotten support are just lies waiting to collapse." Your father sounds like someone who understood a lot more than carpentry. He was a simple man in the best sense of the word. He knew what mattered and didn't waste time on what didn't. We finished the inspection as the sun started its descent toward the hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The property looked less desolate in that light, more like a patient waiting for healing than a corpse waiting for burial. I'd made my professional assessment. The job was doable, challenging, but not impossible, the kind of project that would test everything I'd learned and probably teach me a few things I hadn't. Well, Vivian watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What's the verdict?" "The house is worth saving. The work will take 4 to 6 months, maybe longer, depending on what we find once we start opening up walls. Budget somewhere around 200,000, give or take, for surprises." I expected her to negotiate, to push back, to demonstrate the wealthy person's reflexive need to pay less than asking price for everything. Instead, she nodded. "Done." "What are your terms?" "I've got 3 conditions. First, I do the work my way. You're hiring me for my expertise, not to follow orders. Second, I preserve as much of the original material as possible, even when replacement would be easier. This house deserves better than being gutted and refilled with modern substitutes." She was nodding before I finished. "And the third, you trust me when I tell you we've hit a complication. Old houses are full of secrets, and not all of them are pleasant. If I say we need more time or more resources, I need you to believe that's not a con." "Agreed." She extended her hand and we shook on it, her grip as firm as it had been at our first meeting. "Though I have a condition of my own." "Name it." "I want to be involved in the work. Not just writing checks from Austin, but actually here, actually learning what you're doing and why. I spent 30 years forgetting I ever knew how to build things. I'd like to remember." The request should have felt like an intrusion, a client inserting herself into the process in ways that would slow everything down. Instead, it felt like something else, something I recognized from my own journey into this trade. The hunger to understand, to create, to shape the physical world with your own hands and see the results of your effort. Building isn't easy, I wonder. Your hands will hurt, your muscles will ache. You'll make mistakes that cost time and money, and you'll have to learn from them instead of just paying someone else to fix them. I understand, do you? Because most people who say they want to learn actually just want to watch. There's a difference between observing and participating. Her chin lifted slightly, a flash of the steel I'd glimpsed beneath her careful surface. Mr. Thornton, I didn't get where I am by being afraid of hard work. I got here by being afraid of the wrong things. I'd like to stop being afraid of the right ones for a change. That was an answer I could respect. We shook hands again, and I felt something shift in the air between us, some door opening that neither of us had quite planned to unlock. Fair enough, but if you're going to be working alongside me, you should probably call me Garrett. Mr. Thornton was my father. Vivian, her smile was small but real, transforming her whole face in ways I hadn't expected. Though I warn you, I haven't let anyone call me that in years. Then maybe it's time to start. The drive home felt different than the drive there, though I couldn't have explained exactly why. The landscape was the same, the familiar curves and rises of roads I'd traveled countless times. But something had shifted inside me. Some door I'd kept carefully closed now cracked open to let in light I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. Or at least I didn't think it was. Vivian Ashford was a married woman older than me by several years and connected to my family through a failed relationship I had no interest in revisiting. There were 100 reasons why any kind of personal involvement would be complicated, at best disastrous at worst. But there was something there, some connection that went beyond the professional, some recognition of a kindred spirit trapped in circumstances neither of us had quite chosen. I'd spent 7 years since Linda's death, convinced that my capacity for that kind of connection had died with her. Now I wasn't so sure. Colt was waiting at my house when I pulled in his truck, parked in its usual spot, like he'd never quite moved out, despite having his own place across town. He met me on the porch with 2 beers already opened, his expression mixing curiosity with something that might have been concern. How'd it go? I took the beer, settling into my usual chair with the familiar creak of wood that had known my weight for decades. It went fine. Good project, fair client, challenging work. And what? He gave me that look again, the one that said he'd inherited too much of his mother's perception for my own comfort. Dad, I've watched you come home from job sites for 26 years. You've never looked like this after a planning meeting. Like what? He considered the question before answering, choosing his words with unusual care. Like something woke up that's been sleeping for a long time. Like you're actually looking forward to something instead of just getting through it. The observation landed harder than I wanted to admit. Was I that transparent? Had I spent 7 years convincing myself I was fine, when everyone around me could see I was barely surviving? It's a good project, I said finally, because that part at least was true. The kind of restoration work that matters. House with history client who cares about doing it right. Those don't come along often. And the client, the woman whose daughter broke my heart, your relationship with Carrie has nothing to do with my professional dealings with her mother. But Colt pressed. But nothing. Mrs. Ashford wants her childhood home restored. I'm qualified to do it. End of story. He let it drop, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting, painting my father's handiwork in shades of purple and gold, and I let myself feel something I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Dangerous, foolish hope. The sense that maybe, just maybe, there was still something ahead worth walking toward instead of just more of the same endless behind. 3 weeks later, I stood in the Fredericksburg house with the first delivery of salvaged lumber stacked around me like promises waiting to be kept. The work had begun in earnest now, the careful process of assessing and preserving and slowly bringing something dead back to life. I'd hired a small crew for the heavy lifting, good men I'd worked with before who understood that this wasn't a race and that careful mattered more than fast. Vivian had been true to her word. Every weekend she drove down from Austin, changing from her foundation clothes into jeans and work boots, rolling up her sleeves to learn whatever I was willing to teach her. She was a quick study, her engineering background, giving her frameworks for understanding that most beginners lacked. When I explained load-bearing walls and structural integrity, she grasped the concepts immediately. When I showed her how to recognize wood that was worth saving versus wood that had rotted past redemption, she asked questions that revealed she was actually thinking instead of just listening. We developed a rhythm over those early weeks, a pattern of working and talking that felt increasingly natural. She told me more about her childhood in this house, about her father's accident and the family's slow spiral into financial crisis, about meeting Preston at university and being dazzled by his confidence and certainty and the safety he seemed to represent. I told her about my own family, about Warren Thornton's philosophy of craft and integrity, about Linda's illness and death and the hollow years that followed, about Colt and my pride in who he'd become, despite or maybe because of our family's lack of prestigious credentials. One afternoon, while we were taking a break on the partially rebuilt porch, she asked me something no one had asked in years. Do you think you'll ever remarry? The question should have felt intrusive. Instead, it felt like the natural extension of everything else we'd shared. I don't know. For a long time, I thought I was done with all that. Linda was my whole heart. When she died, I figured that part of me died with her. And now I'm not sure of anything, which is either growth or delusion, depending on how you look at it. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. I know what you mean. I've been married for 32 years, and most of that time, I've felt more alone than I ever felt when I was actually single. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from sharing a bed with someone who's never once asked what you dream about. The admission hung between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. We were venturing into territory that had nothing to do with construction, nothing to do with the professional relationship that was supposed to define our connection. Preston sounds like a difficult man, I said carefully. Difficult. That's diplomatic. She turned to look at me directly, her guard lower than I'd ever seen it. He's efficient and successful and admired by everyone who matters in Austin society. He's also incapable of seeing anyone else as fully human. I'm not a partner to him, Garrett. I'm an asset, a piece of property that appreciates in value when properly maintained. No one should live like that. Millions of people do. We tell ourselves stories about duty and stability and keeping up appearances. We convince ourselves that comfort is close enough to happiness that we shouldn't complain. And then one day we wake up at 58 and realize we've spent our whole adult life being a supporting character in someone else's story. The bitterness in her voice was new, rawer than anything she'd shown before. I understood that particular kind of anger, the rage that comes from realizing you traded your truth for someone else's approval and gotten nothing real in return. My father used to say that a man stands on his own 2 feet, not on the diplomas hanging on his wall. That skill and character are what matter, not the credentials other people use to sort us into categories. Your father was wise. He was a carpenter. In most people's eyes, that made him unimportant. Just a working man with calloused hands and sawdust in his hair. But he understood things that Preston Ashford will never understand. He knew that what you build matters more than what you buy. That how you treat people matters more than how they can benefit you. That a man's word should be as solid as his work. Vivian was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between recognition and yearning. You really believe that? It's not about believing, it's about knowing. I've seen it play out 1,000 times. The flashy contractors who promise everything and deliver nothing. The corner cutters who save a few dollars today and cost their clients thousands tomorrow. Shortcuts catch up to everyone eventually. Integrity is the only thing that actually lasts. Then why do so few people seem to value it? Because integrity doesn't advertise. It doesn't brag or compete or make itself impressive at parties. It just shows up day after day doing the work that needs to be done whether anyone's watching or not. Most people are too distracted by the noise to notice the quiet reliability underneath. She was quiet for a long time after that, watching the sun track across the Texas sky while something worked behind her eyes. Finally, she said, I've spent 32 years with a man who has never once shown up for me in the way you describe. Not once. He shows up for appearances and obligations and business advantages. But for me, as a person, never. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most honest thing you can offer. We went back to work after that, the physical labor providing distance from the emotional territory we'd wandered into. But something had changed, some boundary had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't been crossed. I knew things about Vivian Ashford now that I probably shouldn't know, things that made her feel less like a client and more like a person I was beginning to genuinely care about. That was dangerous. We both knew it was dangerous, and neither of us seemed willing or able to step back to safer ground. The letter arrived on a Tuesday evening 3 months into the project. I was going through my father's old toolbox looking for a specific gauge of chisel I knew he'd owned when my fingers found something that didn't belong. An envelope, yellowed with age, tucked beneath a false bottom I'd never noticed before. The handwriting on the front was Warren's unmistakable, even after years of not seeing it. For Garrett when you're ready. My hands trembled as I opened it, knowing somehow that whatever was inside had the power to change things. My father had been a man of few words but profound intention. If he'd hidden something for me to find, he'd had his reasons. Son, the letter began, if you're reading this, you've probably lost something important and you're looking for answers in places you wouldn't normally look. That's good. That means you're still searching, still reaching, still believing there might be something worth finding. There's something I never told you about my life before your mother. A woman I loved from a wealthy family who loved me back. We met at a church where I was doing restoration work, and for a few months I thought we'd find a way to make it work, despite everything that said we shouldn't. I let fear win. Her family disapproved. My pride got wounded, and I convinced myself that the gap between our worlds was too wide to bridge. I walked away before she could reject me, before I had to face the possibility that loving someone isn't always enough. I don't regret my life with your mother. She was the greatest gift I ever received, and you and Colt are the best parts of both of us. But I do regret letting fear make my decisions. I regret not being brave enough to fight for something I wanted because I was too afraid of losing. The differences between people, the gaps of class and age and circumstance, those are walls we build ourselves, not walls God puts in our way. If you find yourself facing such a wall, if you find yourself loving someone, the world says you shouldn't, remember that the world is often wrong about what matters. Love, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through tears, or hadn't known I was holding back. My father, the most solid and certain man I'd ever known, had carried this secret his whole life. Had loved someone he'd let go, had wondered what if, even while building a beautiful life with my mother. And he'd left this message for me hidden where I'd only find it if I was already searching for something, already reaching toward answers I was afraid to ask for. The timing felt like more than coincidence. 3 months of working alongside Vivian, 3 months of conversations that went deeper than they should, 3 months of watching her slowly come back to life as she learned to use her hands for something other than writing checks and hosting parties. I knew her now. Knew the person beneath the Ice Queen exterior, knew the brilliant engineer who'd traded her dreams for someone else's idea of security. And I knew with a certainty that terrified me that I was developing feelings I had no business feeling. She was married. She was connected to my family through Colt and Carrie's failed relationship. She was older than me, richer than me, from a world I'd never belonged to and never wanted to belong to. None of that changed what I felt. My father was right. The heart doesn't negotiate with circumstance. I called Hank that night, needing to talk to someone who'd known me long enough to call me on my bullshit. You're falling for her, he said flatly before I'd even finished explaining the situation. I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you do. You're just scared to name it. She's married Hank, to a man who could destroy my career with a phone call. And she's Carrie's mother, which makes this approximately 10,000 times more complicated than it already was. All true. Also irrelevant. The question isn't whether it's complicated. It's whether she's worth the complication. I didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, I did, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud. My father left me a letter. I changed the subject, or tried to, about a woman he loved before Mom, someone from a wealthy family, someone he let go because he was afraid. Warren Thornton afraid, the man once faced down a charging bull with nothing but a 2x4 in attitude, afraid of rejection, of not being good enough, of the gap between their worlds being too wide to bridge. Hank was quiet for a long moment, and you're sitting there holding that letter thinking about Vivian Ashford and wondering if history is about to repeat itself. Something like that. Then let me tell you what your father would say if he were here. He'd say that money is just numbers on paper, but character is what you are when no one's watching. He'd say that a man who builds things knows that the strongest structures are the ones that can bend without breaking. And he'd say that loving someone who scares you is the bravest thing a person can do. Dad always was better with words than me. He was better with everything than most people. But he raised you right, Garrett. Whatever you decide, you'll make it the right decision by how you handle it. After we hung up, I sat with my father's letter until midnight, reading and rereading his words until they were burned into my memory. Then I made a decision, not about what to do next, but about what to stop doing. I was going to stop pretending I didn't feel what I felt. Stop hiding behind professionalism and propriety and all the other walls I'd built to keep myself safe from the vulnerability of actually caring. Vivian Ashford was more than a client. Whatever was growing between us was more than convenience. And if that made things complicated, well, complication was just another word for life being interesting. Tomorrow I'd go back to Fredericksburg and keep working on her house. Keep teaching her what I knew about restoration and craft and the patient process of bringing broken things back to wholeness. Keep watching her transform from the ice queen everyone expected into the vibrant, intelligent woman she'd always been underneath. And maybe if I was brave enough, I'd start being honest about why that mattered so much. The message came through at 11 on a Thursday night, the phone buzzing against my nightstand like a warning I should have heeded. Carrie Ashford's name glowed on the screen, a name I hadn't seen since that awkward afternoon at her family's estate 4 months ago. Meet me at Magnolia Cafe tomorrow, 7 p.m. Don't tell my mother. I stared at those words until the screen dimmed my mind, racing through possibilities, none of which seemed good. Carrie had made her feelings about me clear enough through her treatment of Colt. Whatever she wanted now, it wasn't going to be pleasant. The cafe was crowded when I arrived, the dinner rush filling every booth with families and couples and clusters of friends enjoying the kind of casual evening I'd almost forgotten existed. Carrie sat alone in a corner, her business suit suggesting she'd come straight from her law firm, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. She didn't stand when I approached, didn't offer her hand, or any of the social niceties her upbringing must have drilled into her. Just looked at me with eyes that held something I couldn't quite identify, something between accusation and plea. "Mr. Thornton, thank you for coming." I slid into the booth across from her, keeping my hands visible on the table like I was negotiating with someone who might be armed. "Your message didn't leave much room for declining." "No, it didn't." She picked up her coffee cup, then set it down without drinking the gesture, revealing nervousness she was trying hard to hide. "I need to talk to you about my mother." The words landed like a punch I'd been expecting, but hoping wouldn't come. "What about her?" "She's different. Has been for months now, ever since she started this project with you." She paused, choosing her next words with the precision of someone trained to argue for a living. "She buys jeans now, jeans, Mr. Thornton. My mother hasn't worn denim since before I was born. People change. Not my mother, not like this." Her voice carried an edge of frustration that bordered on desperation. "She talks about you. Not constantly, not obviously, but enough. Garrett thinks this about the foundation work." Garrett explained why old houses matter. "She quotes you like you're some kind of authority on everything that matters in life. I'm teaching her about restoration. That requires conversation." "Is that all it requires?" Carrie leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "Because I've watched my mother go through the motions of marriage for 28 years. I've watched her smile at parties while her eyes stayed dead. I've watched her become exactly what my father wanted, a perfect accessory to his perfect life. And now suddenly she's alive again, and you're the only variable that changed." The accusation hung between us like smoke, dangerous and impossible to ignore. I could deny it, could retreat behind professional boundaries, implausible deniability. But something in Carrie's expression suggested she'd see through any lie I told. "What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me what's really going on." "Are you sleeping with my mother?" The question hit harder than I'd expected. Not because it was unfair, but because the honest answer was so much more complicated than yes or no. "No. I've never touched your mother inappropriately. We work together, we talk, we've become something like friends. That's all." "Friends." The word dripped with skepticism. "My mother doesn't have friends. She has social obligations and networking contacts, and people she tolerates for my father's benefit. She doesn't do actual human connection." Maybe she didn't before. Maybe something changed, something like you. I couldn't argue with that, couldn't pretend I hadn't noticed the same transformation Carrie was describing. Vivian had changed over these months, had shed layers of armor I hadn't even realized she was wearing until they were gone. The woman who showed up in Fredericksburg now bore little resemblance to the ice queen I'd glimpsed at that first meeting. Your mother spent 30 years hiding who she really is. I chose my words carefully, aware of how much weight they carried. She's starting to remember. That's got nothing to do with me and everything to do with her finally having space to breathe. Space you gave her, space the project gave her. I'm just the contractor. Carrie studied me for a long moment, her lawyer's instincts clearly working overtime. You're not just anything, Mr. Thornton. I've done my research. People in this industry talk about you like you're some kind of throwback to when craftsmanship meant something. Honest Garrett, they call you. The guy who'd rather lose a buff than cut a corner. I learned from my father, Warren Thornton, the legendary carpenter who turned down work from Preston Ashford because he refused to do substandard labor. She smiled thinly. My father still talks about that, you know. The working class nobody who had the audacity to say no to him. He's never forgotten the insult. That information settled into place like a puzzle piece I hadn't known was missing. Preston Ashford and my family had history, adversarial history long before Colt ever met Carrie. Whatever was building between Vivian and me wasn't happening in a vacuum. Your father and I have different definitions of insult. Clearly. Carrie leaned back, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Look, I'm not here to threaten you or warn you off or whatever you might be expecting. I'm here because something is happening in my family and I can't figure out what it means. What do you want it to mean? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She was quiet for several seconds, her gaze dropping to the table between us. I want my mother to be happy. That probably surprises you given everything. But I grew up watching her shrink year after year, becoming less and less herself until I wasn't sure there was anyone left inside. If you're the reason she's coming back to life, then maybe I should be thanking you instead of interrogating you. But I'm also terrified of what happens when my father figures out what's going on. Preston Ashford doesn't lose Mr. Thornton. He doesn't tolerate challenges to his authority or threats to his image. If he decides you're a problem, he'll destroy you without a second thought. I've faced difficult men before. Not like him. Her voice carried genuine fear beneath the warning. He has resources you can't imagine and a complete absence of conscience about using them. Whatever you think you know about power, multiply it by a factor of 10, and you'll start to approach what Preston can bring to bear. So what are you suggesting? That I walk away from the project? From your mother, I'm suggesting you be very careful about what you're walking toward. Some doors, once you open them, can't be closed again. We parted without resolution, her warnings echoing in my mind as I drove home through Austin's glittering sprawl. The city looked different at night, bright lights and hidden shadows, beauty, masking complexity, in ways that felt uncomfortably metaphorical. Carrie was right about one thing. Something was happening, something neither Vivian nor I had planned or fully acknowledged. We'd built a connection over these months, a bond that transcended the professional relationship that was supposed to contain it. Every conversation pushed us deeper into each other's history. Every shared moment of honest emotion eroded the walls we'd both constructed around our real selves. I didn't know what to call it yet, didn't know if it had a future or even should have one. But I knew it was real and I knew it was dangerous, and I knew that walking away now would require a kind of strength I wasn't sure I possessed. The next weekend in Fredericksburg brought revelations neither of us expected. We were working on the kitchen, carefully removing decades-old cabinets to assess the wall structure beneath, when Vivian suddenly stopped what she was doing and turned to face me. I need to tell you something. Her voice carried an unfamiliar gravity that made me set down my tools. I'm listening. Preston knows. About the house, about you, about everything. He's known for weeks. She swallowed hard. He had me followed, hired investigators to document where I was going, who I was meeting with, how often we were alone together. The news should have surprised me more than it did. Carrie's warning had primed me for something like this, some evidence that Preston Ashford was paying closer attention than we'd assumed. What is he planning to do about it? That's the thing. Nothing, at least not directly. Vivian moved to the window, staring out at the overgrown property with eyes that seemed focused on something far beyond the immediate view. He confronted me 2 days ago, showed me photographs, transcripts of conversations, a timeline of every moment we've spent together. He wasn't angry. That's what scared me most. He was clinical about it, like he was presenting evidence in a business negotiation. What did he say? that I could continue my little hobby project as long as I maintained appearances. That whatever I was looking for outside our marriage, I wouldn't find it with someone like you. That he was prepared to be patient because he knew I'd eventually come to my senses. She turned back to face me, her expression carrying something I'd never seen there before. Defiance. But then he said something else. Something that changed everything. What he told me, he's been rearranging our assets for the past 2 years. Moving money into accounts and structures I can't touch. Preparing for the possibility that I might someday try to leave. She laughed bitterly. He's been planning for this longer than we've known each other, Garrett. He saw it coming before I did. The calculated cruelty of it made my stomach turn. Preston Ashford hadn't just been monitoring his wife, he'd been systematically stripping her of options, building a cage around her escape routes while she was still too trapped to notice. What does that mean if you try to divorce him? It means I walk away with almost nothing. The house in Westlake is in his name. The investment accounts are in trusts I'm not a beneficiary of. Even the foundation, the work I've spent 15 years building, is structured in ways that give him ultimate control. Everything I thought was mine never really was. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. 32 years of marriage, and Preston had spent at least 2 of them preparing to leave his wife destitute if she ever dared to assert herself. That can't be legal. Preston has very good lawyers. They've made sure everything is technically above board, even if it's morally bankrupt. We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of her revelation pressing down on both of us. Then I asked the question that mattered most. What do you want to do about it? Her answer came without hesitation. I want to leave anyway, even knowing what you'd be giving up. What am I giving up? A house I've never felt at home in. Money that comes with chains attached. The privilege of being Preston Ashford's perfectly maintained accessory. She crossed the space between us, stopping close enough that I could see the tears forming in her eyes. For the first time in 32 years, I know what I actually want. I want to wake up in the morning without dreading every hour of the day ahead. I want to work with my hands on something that matters. I want conversations that go deeper than social pleasantries and business small talk. Vivian, I'm not saying this because I expect anything from you. Her voice broke slightly. I'm saying it because I need you to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. This isn't a midlife crisis or a phase or whatever Preston wants to believe. This is me finally waking up after 3 decades of sleepwalking. You didn't cause that, Garrett. But you showed me it was possible. I reached for her hand before I could stop myself, her fingers cold against my work-roughened palm. We stood like that for what felt like hours, 2 people on the edge of something neither fully understood, both terrified and both unwilling to step back. I'm not going anywhere. The words came out steadier than I expected. Whatever happens next, whatever Preston tries to do, you're not facing it alone. That's a dangerous promise to make. The best ones usually are. I told Colt everything the next day. He deserved to know what was developing, deserved the chance to react however he needed to react. I found him at a job site in East Austin, up to his elbows in wiring for a new restaurant build, and I asked for 15 minutes of his time. His expression shifted through about 7 different emotions as I talked, ranging from disbelief to anger to something that might have been grudging understanding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, working through whatever was happening inside his head. So you're falling for Carrie's mom? It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. Yes, and she's leaving her husband because of you. She's leaving her husband because of herself. I'm just someone who showed up at the right time. That's a convenient way to frame it. It's an honest way to frame it. I met his eyes directly. I spent 7 years after your mother died, feeling like I'd never feel anything again. Never want anything again. Never care about anyone except you deeply enough to risk being hurt again. Vivian didn't create those feelings. She just woke them up. Colt turned away, pacing the length of the unfinished restaurant space with his hands shoved in his pockets. I watched him process, watched him wrestle with the same complications I'd been wrestling with for months. Mrs. Ashford wasn't kind to me, he finally said. When Carrie and I were together, her mother barely acknowledged my existence. She looked through me like I wasn't worth seeing, I know. But Carrie says she's different now. Says whatever you've been doing with her has changed something fundamental. Carrie told you that we've been talking. He turned back to face me. Not about getting back together or anything like that. Just talking, trying to understand what happened between us and why. She says a lot of it was her parents' influence, the way they raised her to value status over substance. She's reconsidering a lot of things. The revelation surprised me more than it probably should have. Carrie and Colt, the two people most directly affected by whatever was building between Vivian and me, were finding their own path through the wreckage. What does that mean for you? It means I'm trying not to judge. He took a deep breath. You're my father. I've watched you sacrifice and struggle and keep showing up no matter how hard things got. If there's someone who makes you happy, someone who brings back the version of you that existed before mom died, then maybe that matters more than the complications. Even with all those complications piled on top of each other, even then, his mouth quirked towards something almost like a smile. Besides, I'm a Thornton. We don't do easy. Your grandfather used to say that. I know. You've only told me about 1,000 times. The tension between us cracked, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something more manageable. We weren't going to solve everything in one conversation. But we'd started talking, really talking, and that was more than I could have hoped for. The fire came 3 weeks later, announcing itself with a phone call that stopped my heart. Dot's voice on the other end was steady, but strained as she explained that the electrical system at the Ashford estate had failed catastrophically. Flames in the basement, spreading fast emergency services on their way, but not yet arrived. Vivian was inside. Preston was traveling for business. No one else was there except Dot, who had called me before calling anyone else. I broke at least 6 traffic laws getting there, my truck eating up the distance between Kyle and Westlake Hills, like the miles personally offended me. Colt somehow beat me there, his work van already parked at the curb when I arrived, his face lit by the flickering glow coming from the basement windows. The professional in me assessed the situation, even as the rest of me fought down panic. The fire hadn't spread beyond the lower level yet, but the electrical system was compromised, which meant every circuit in the house was a potential hazard. Standard procedure would be to wait for the fire department to let the trained professionals handle a situation this dangerous. Standard procedure could go to hell. Vivian was in there. Dad, no. Colt grabbed my arm as I moved toward the door. The electrical system is shot. If you go in there without cutting the main power, you could get electrocuted before the fire even touches you. Then we cut the power. The main panel is in the basement. Where the fire is, there has to be another way. He was quiet for maybe 3 seconds, his electrician's brain running through options faster than words could follow. The external disconnect. Most houses this size have one somewhere on the property, usually near the meter base. It would cut everything upstream of the main panel. Find it. We split up, racing around the perimeter of the estate in opposite directions. The smoke was thickening now, dark tendrils curling up from basement vents, like the house itself was exhaling poison. Through a side window, I could see flames licking at the walls, hungry, and growing hungrier by the second. Colt's voice carried across the property. Found it east side behind the generator housing. I met him there, watching as he threw the disconnect with the confidence of someone who'd done similar work 1,000 times. The estate went dark, every light and appliance dying simultaneously, the sudden silence almost as frightening as the noise had been. The fire didn't care about electricity. It kept burning, fed by old wood and decades of accumulated debris in a basement no one had properly maintained. But at least now we wouldn't cook ourselves on live wires trying to get inside. I'll go for the suppression equipment. Colt was already moving toward the fire department truck that had just screamed into the driveway. You find her. I didn't argue, didn't have time to argue. I found a door on the east side of the house away from the worst of the smoke, and I went in. The interior was a maze of shadows and haze emergency lighting, providing just enough illumination to navigate by. I called Vivian's name, my voice competing with the growing roar from below, and for several terrible seconds I heard nothing back. Then from somewhere above me, her response. Garrett, up here. I can't get down. The stairs collapsed. I followed the sound of her voice to a second-floor landing where a section of staircase had given way, leaving a gap too wide to jump safely and too far to reach from below. Vivian stood on the far side, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with fear, but not panic. Is there another way down? Not from this side of the house? And the fire spreading too fast for me to go back through the main hall. I looked around, my contractor's instincts kicking in even in the chaos. The gap in the stairs was maybe 8 feet too wide for her to cross, but not impossible to bridge. I needed something long enough and strong enough to span the distance. A decorative wooden beam ran along the hallway ceiling, purely ornamental from what I could tell, but solid oak and anchored at both ends. I grabbed it, testing its weight, then wrenched it free from its mounting brackets with strength I didn't know I had. I'm going to put this across the gap. I need you to walk on it. Garrett, I can't. Yes, you can. Trust me. Trust yourself. I positioned the beam as carefully as possible, creating a makeshift bridge between her side and mine. It wasn't perfect, wasn't safe by any reasonable standard, but it was all we had. Vivian stepped onto the wood with the same careful precision she brought to everything, her engineering background serving her well in a moment when most people would have frozen. One foot then another, her balance steady despite the chaos swirling around us. I held the beam in place, bracing it against my own body, willing her to make it across. She did. We both made it out, collapsing onto the front lawn just as the fire department started pumping water into the basement. The flames died reluctantly, hissing and steaming as they surrendered to overwhelming force, leaving behind smoke damage and structural wounds, but not the total destruction that had seemed inevitable minutes before. Colt found us there, sitting on grass that was somehow still dewy despite everything, and he didn't say a word. Just sat down beside us, the three of us forming a strange tableau of exhaustion and relief. You saved my life. Vivian's voice was hoarse from smoke, barely above a whisper. Both of you. I just found the disconnect. Colt shrugged like he hadn't done anything extraordinary. Dad's the one who did the heroic rescue stuff. You found the disconnect. Without that, neither of us would have made it inside. I looked at my son, feeling something shift between us that had been out of alignment for weeks. That was good thinking under pressure. Your grandfather would have been proud. Something softened in Colt's expression, some wall coming down that I hadn't even realized was still standing. Yeah, well, Thorntons don't do easy. The aftermath of the fire brought changes none of us had anticipated. Vivian refused to return to the main house even after the damage was repaired, choosing instead to stay in Fredericksburg while the restoration continued. Dot came with her, both women settling into the half-finished house like refugees from a life that no longer fit them. Preston responded to his wife's absence with the clinical efficiency Vivian had described. No angry phone calls, no dramatic confrontations, just a series of legal documents delivered by messenger that outlined his terms for their continued arrangement. She could keep her little project, keep her distance, keep whatever delusions about independence she was entertaining. But the moment she formally moved toward divorce, he would activate every financial weapon at his disposal. It was blackmail dressed in the language of reasonable negotiation, and Vivian saw it for exactly what it was. He thinks I care about money. She was sitting on the porch of the Fredericksburg house watching the sunset over the hills, her voice carrying a calm that hadn't been there a week ago. He spent so long believing that's what motivates everyone, that he can't imagine someone choosing poverty over his particular brand of wealth. It won't be poverty. You'll have the house here. You'll have whatever you can earn on your own, which won't be much at 58 with a 30-year gap in my resume. You have skills, contacts, a reputation for the foundation work you've done. Those count for something. She turned to look at me, her expression mixing determination with something softer. They count for something, but they count for less than what I'll be giving up by any rational calculation. So don't be rational. The smile that crossed her face was small but genuine. That's the most Warren Thornton thing you've ever said to me. How do you figure? Because he believed that some things matter more than calculation. That integrity and self-respect are worth more than any price the world can put on them. She reached for my hand, her grip stronger than it had been months ago. I believe that too. I think I always believed it. I just forgot for a while. Preston's response to Vivian's continued defiance came through Carrie, who appeared in Fredericksburg on a Thursday afternoon with news that none of us had seen coming. He's calling a family meeting. Her voice was tight as she delivered the message. This weekend at the house. He says it's time to discuss the future of our family and our various obligations to each other. That sounds like a trap. Everything with my father is a trap, but I don't think we have a choice about attending. If Mom refuses to show up, he'll use that as evidence of abandonment or psychological instability, or whatever his lawyers think will play best in a courtroom. Vivian's expression hardened into something that reminded me of the woman I'd first met at that engagement party. Fine. If Preston wants a family meeting, he'll get one. But I'm not going alone. She looked at me as she said it, the implication clear. Whatever was about to happen, we would face it together. The Ashford estate looked different in winterlight, the gardens dormant and the stone walls somehow starker without the softening effect of summer foliage. Preston had arranged the meeting in his study, a room designed to intimidate with its dark wood paneling and walls of leather-bound books that had probably never been read. He sat behind a massive desk like a king receiving potentially rebellious subjects, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his suit probably costing more than most people's monthly rent. Carrie stood near the window, her face carefully neutral in a way that must have taken years of practice to perfect. Vivian took a chair across from her husband with the posture of someone who'd decided to stop being afraid. And I stood behind her, uninvited but present, a statement of alliance that Preston clearly hadn't anticipated. Mr. Thornton. His voice was cool, controlled, entirely unsurprised. I don't recall including you in this family gathering. I'm here as Vivian's support. Vivian doesn't need support. She needs to remember her obligations. Vivian can speak for herself. She cut in before the testosterone could escalate further. And her only obligation is to her own conscience. Not to your image, not to your business interests, not to whatever version of reality you've constructed to justify your behavior. Preston's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Behavior. That's an interesting word choice from a woman who's been carrying on with the hired help for the past 6 months. I haven't been carrying on with anyone. Whatever your investigators told you, they saw 2 people working together on a restoration project. Nothing more. Nothing more. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer, spreading photographs across the surface like playing cards. These images tell a different story. The 2 of you alone in that house, week after week. Conversations that went far beyond professional consultation. Physical contact that seems rather intimate for a client-contractor relationship. I looked at the photographs and saw exactly what Preston wanted the world to see, moments stripped of context, ordinary interactions reframed as evidence of something sordid. A hand on a shoulder during a difficult conversation. 2 people standing close while examining a piece of restored woodwork. Nothing inappropriate, but nothing that couldn't be twisted by someone determined to find wrongdoing. You can make those pictures tell any story you want. My voice came out steadier than I expected, but they're not evidence of anything except 2 adults having honest conversations about work and life. Honest conversations. Preston's smile didn't reach his eyes. Is that what you call it when a married woman tells a strange man about her unhappy marriage? When she confides things she's never shared with her own family? I call it being human. Something you might try sometime. The room went very still. I hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to provoke a man who could crush me professionally without breaking a sweat. But I was tired of watching him manipulate and maneuver, tired of seeing Vivian shrink under the weight of his calculated cruelty. Preston's expression shifted from contempt to something more dangerous. Amusement mixed with anticipation, like a predator who just realized his prey was going to make the hunt interesting. You have spirit, Mr. Thornton. I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't pay mortgages or win custody battles or protect your professional reputation from the consequences of poor choices. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. He leaned back in his chair, the posture of someone who held on all the cards and knew it. I've spent 30 years building an empire, Mr. Thornton. I've destroyed men with more resources and better connections than you possess. If you think your blue-collar integrity and your father's good reputation will protect you from what I can do, you're more naive than I gave you credit for. Carrie stepped forward, then her movement drawing everyone's attention. Actually, Father, there's something you should know. Carolyn, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time. She pulled her own folder from her bag, smaller than Preston's, but apparently just as significant. While you've been busy documenting Mom's friendship with Mr. Thornton, I've been doing some research of my own into your business practices, your financial arrangements, and your extracurricular activities in Houston. The color drained from Preston's face so fast I thought he might pass out. I don't know what you think you found, but I found your other family. Carrie's voice was ice. The woman you've been keeping in a house you bought 12 years ago. the two children you've been supporting, the parallel life you've been living while holding mom to standards you never applied to yourself. The revelation hit the room like a bomb, reshaping everything I thought I understood about the Ashford situation. Preston's calculated cruelty toward Vivian wasn't just control for its own sake. It was deflection, misdirection, a way of keeping attention focused on her perceived failures while his actual betrayals remained hidden. Preston's composure cracked for the first time since I'd met him. Where did you get this information? It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is what I do with it. Carrie's expression showed no mercy. You can use those photographs to make mom look bad in a divorce proceeding. But I can use what I have to make you look worse. And unlike your evidence, mine involves actual wrongdoing. You wouldn't. You're my daughter. I'm also mom's daughter, something you seem to have forgotten. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that Preston seemed physically smaller, diminished by the exposure of secrets he'd spent over a decade protecting. He looked at his wife, then at his daughter, then at me, and I watched him calculate the new odds with a mind that never stopped strategizing even in defeat. What do you want? Carrie glanced at Vivian, some silent communication passing between them. Mom gets a fair settlement, half of everything minus whatever you've already hidden in ways we can't trace. The house in Fredericksburg, free and clear. And no interference in her life going forward. Not from you, not from your lawyers, not from anyone you might hire to make her miserable. And if I agree, then we keep your Houston family out of the public record. Your reputation stays intact. Your business relationships remain unaffected, and you get to tell whatever story you want about why your marriage ended. Preston was quiet for a long moment, his calculating mind clearly running through scenarios and counter-scenarios. Finally, he nodded. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers. You'll have them draw up fair papers. I'll be reviewing every word. The meeting ended shortly after that, the formal hostilities giving way to an uneasy truce that satisfied no one, but at least provided a path forward. Preston disappeared into another part of the house, probably to begin damage control, with whoever needed to know his carefully constructed image had developed cracks. Carrie lingered as Vivian and I prepared to leave her expression, carrying something that might have been relief or exhaustion, or both. I didn't do it for you. She addressed me directly for the first time since the confrontation began. I did it because it was right, because my mother deserves better than what my father was planning to do to her. I know, but I also did it because Colt believes in you. He says you're the most honorable man he knows, that you've never once broken a promise or compromised your integrity. That kind of recommendation counts for something. Your son has always been good at reading people. So was mine. I just wasn't listening. She left without another word, but something had changed between us. Not friendship, not yet, but the possibility of it. A door cracked open that might someday lead somewhere unexpected. The drive back to Fredericksburg was quiet, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Vivian stared out the window at the passing landscape, her profile lit by the afternoon sun, her expression carrying a complexity I couldn't fully read. I didn't know about Houston. Her voice was soft, almost wondering. 32 years and I never suspected. I thought I was the problem. I thought there was something wrong with me that made him so cold, so distant. There's nothing wrong with you. I know that now. But knowing and believing are different things. She turned to look at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He made me feel invisible, Garrett. For 3 decades, he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And the whole time he was seeing someone else, loving someone else, building a life somewhere else while I tried to figure out what I was doing wrong. You weren't doing anything wrong. I was doing the only thing wrong that mattered. I was staying. She took a shaky breath. But I'm not staying anymore. Whatever happens with the settlement, whatever complications arise, I'm done being a ghost in my own life. I reached across the console and took her hand, the gesture feeling natural in a way that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. You're the least ghost-like person I've ever met. That's because you see me. You've always seen me. From that first day in the garden when you heard me say something I didn't mean for anyone to hear. You looked at me like I was actually there. Do you know how long it had been since anyone looked at me like that? I didn't answer because the answer seemed less important than the moment itself. We were driving towards something neither of us could fully predict, leaving behind a world that had constrained us both in different ways. The future was uncertain, probably difficult, definitely complicated. But for the first time in 7 years, I found myself looking forward to finding out what came next. The weeks following the confrontation brought their own challenges. Preston's lawyers proved as aggressive as Carrie had predicted, fighting over every clause and calculation in the divorce settlement. But Carrie fought back with equal ferocity, her legal expertise transforming from a tool of the establishment into a weapon of liberation. Colt and I worked through our remaining tensions, slowly rebuilding the easy relationship we'd had before everything got complicated. He came down to Fredericksburg, occasionally helping with electrical work that the house still needed, and I watched him start to see Vivian as someone distinct from Carrie's mother, a person in her own right rather than an extension of the family that had hurt him. The professional fallout Preston had threatened never fully materialized. Some clients quietly disappeared, the wealthy ones who ran in the same circles and couldn't afford to associate with scandal. But others appeared to replace them, people who'd heard about what happened and respected me more for it. Hank spread the word through the contractor community, and by spring, my calendar was as full as it had ever been. The restoration of Vivian's childhood home continued through winter and into early spring, the work proceeding steadily despite all the drama swirling around it. We replaced what needed replacing and preserved what could be saved. And slowly the house began to remember what it had been before time, and neglect had worn it down. Sometimes I caught Vivian standing in finished rooms, her eyes distant, her expression carrying something between grief and joy. She was reclaiming her past while building toward a future she could finally envision, and the process wasn't always easy or comfortable. But it was real. That was the difference. After decades of performing happiness, of maintaining appearances, of being exactly what Preston Ashford required her to be, she was finally discovering what she actually wanted, what actually mattered to her, what kind of life she could build if she stopped letting other people define her boundaries. I was part of that discovery, but I wasn't the center of it. That was important. She wasn't leaving her husband for me, wasn't trading one form of dependence for another. She was choosing herself, choosing freedom, choosing the possibility of becoming whoever she might have been if circumstances had been different. What I offered, what we were building together, was something else entirely. A partnership between equals, a connection based on genuine compatibility rather than social expectation, a chance for both of us to write new chapters in lives that had felt finished. The official end of the Ashford marriage came on a gray day in March, finalized in a courthouse far less impressive than the empire Preston had built around himself. Carrie was there as Vivian's witness, and I waited outside because some thresholds aren't mine to cross. When Vivian emerged, her expression carried 20 different emotions fighting for dominance. Relief and grief and fear and hope all tangled together in ways that would take years to fully sort out. She saw me waiting and walked toward me without hurrying, without pretense, without any of the masks she'd worn for so long. "It's done, I know. I'm terrified. I know that too." She stopped in front of me, close enough to touch, but not quite touching, her eyes searching my face for something I hoped she would find. "Tell me it's going to be okay." I took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her palm against mine. "I can't promise okay. I can't promise easy or simple or free from complication. What I can promise is that you won't face any of it alone. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges or victories or ordinary Tuesday afternoons, we face them together." Is that enough? I thought about my father's letter about the love he'd let go because fear seemed more sensible than faith. About Linda and the years of happiness we'd shared before her death reminded me how temporary everything is. About Colt growing into a man I was endlessly proud of despite all the mistakes I'd made along the way. It's more than enough. It's everything that actually matters. Spring came to Hill Country with its usual extravagance, wildflowers painting the roadsides in waves of blue and orange and red. The divorce settlement had taken longer than anyone wanted, but ended better than anyone expected. Carrie's leverage and legal expertise had translated into terms that gave Vivian genuine independence, not the wealth she'd grown accustomed to as Mrs. Preston Ashford, but enough to live comfortably while she figured out what came next. The Fredericksburg house was hers outright, along with a monthly support payment that would last 5 years and a lump sum that covered immediate needs. The restored house waited at the end of the gravel drive, its limestone walls gleaming in the afternoon sun, its metal roof glinting like it had 40 years ago, when Vivian was still a girl running through these same fields. We'd finished the major work 2 weeks before the divorce was finalized, the timing feeling significant in ways neither of us had planned. Vivian was on the porch when I pulled up a glass of iced tea, sweating in her hand, her bare feet propped on the railing I'd rebuilt from reclaimed oak. She looked nothing like the ice queen I'd glimpsed at that first meeting, nothing like the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for 3 decades of miserable marriage. She looked like herself, finally fully after all these years. Dot emerged from the house with a second glass, pressing it into my hand before I could ask. The two women had developed a partnership over these months that went far beyond employer and employee. They were friends now, genuine friends sharing a household and a mission and the particular bond that forms between people who've survived the same storms. The foundation board called again. Vivian's voice carried a wry amusement that had become increasingly common since her liberation. They want me to consult on their new community development initiative. Apparently, my 15 years of nonprofit experience still counts for something even without Preston's name attached. What did you tell them that I'd think about it? Which I will. But right now, I'm enjoying not having any obligations to anyone except myself. The sentiment would have sounded selfish from someone else. From Vivian, it sounded like hard-won wisdom, the recognition that she'd spent most of her adult life serving other people's agendas and had earned the right to a season of selfish focus. I settled into the chair beside hers, letting the familiar creak of restored wood announce my presence in a space that had come to feel like home. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the property, both of us inhabiting a peace that had seemed impossible not so long ago. Colt called this morning. She broke the silence with news I hadn't expected. He wants to bring Carrie down for dinner this weekend. Both of them. Together. The implications of that request took a moment to fully register. Colt and Carrie had been talking for months, rebuilding something from the wreckage of their previous relationship, but neither had moved toward anything romantic. Or so I'd thought. Are they? I don't know. But they want to spend time with us as a group, which seems significant. It seems complicated. Everything is complicated. The question is whether it's the kind of complicated that's worth working through. I considered that turning the idea over like a piece of wood I was trying to understand. Colt dating Carrie again would add layers of connection that were already tangled beyond easy comprehension. His girlfriend's mother was my partner. Her father was the man who tried to destroy us. The family trees were twisted in directions that would make genealogists weep. But Colt was an adult. Carrie had shown herself to be more than the status-conscious young woman who'd broken my son's heart. If they wanted to explore whatever was growing between them, that was their choice to make. I trust his judgment. The words surprised me even as I said them. If he thinks there's something there worth pursuing, I'll support that. Even with all the complications piled on top of each other, the echo of our conversation from months ago made us both smile. Even then, the dinner that weekend proved to be exactly as awkward and exactly as meaningful as I'd feared. Colt and Carrie arrived together in his truck, their body language suggesting something more than friendship, but not quite yet committed romance. They sat across from Vivian and me at the table Dot had set with wildflowers and the good china that had somehow survived the Ashford estate transition. The food was simple, a roasted chicken with vegetables from the garden Vivian had started bread from the bakery in town. Nothing fancy, nothing designed to impress, just honest sustenance, shared among people trying to figure out how to be a family of some kind. This is strange. Carrie broke the ice with characteristic directness. All of us sitting here together pretending this is normal. Who's pretending? Colt reached for the breadbasket. Nothing about any of us is normal. Might as well own it. He has a point. Vivian's smile carried warmth I'd rarely seen her direct at her daughter. Normal is overrated anyway. I spent 32 years trying to be normal, and all it got me was miserable. So what does this make us? Carrie gestured at the assembled group. Are we family now? Extended family? Some kind of blended situation that doesn't have a name? We're people who care about each other. I found myself speaking before I'd fully planned my words. People who've been through difficult things and come out the other side still standing. Whatever label you put on, that matters less than the reality of it. The philosophy earned me a skeptical look from Carrie and an approving nod from Colt. Vivian reached under the table and squeezed my hand, the gesture invisible to the others but significant to us. Dinner continued with conversation that ranged from work projects to local politics to the surprisingly entertaining drama of Fredericksburg's annual Peach Festival. By the time Dot brought out pie for dessert, something had shifted in the atmosphere. The awkwardness hadn't entirely dissipated, but it had transformed into something more like the productive tension of people learning to navigate unfamiliar territory together. After the meal, Colt and Carrie volunteered for dish duty, leaving Vivian and me alone on the porch in the gathering dusk. The sound of running water and quiet laughter drifted through the open windows, suggesting that whatever was developing between them was proceeding regardless of parental observation. She's different with him. Vivian's voice was soft, wondering, lighter than I've ever seen her. When she was with that Jonathan person before everything fell apart, she was always performing, always trying to be the perfect future wife he wanted. With Colt, she's just herself. He's good for her, and I think she's good for him. The mess they went through before the way it ended, maybe that was necessary to get them to a place where they could actually see each other clearly. You believe that? That sometimes things have to fall apart before they can come together the right way? I looked at the woman beside me, at the lines around her eyes that mapped decades of suppressed emotion, at the silver threading through hair. She'd stopped dying because she no longer cared about meeting anyone's standards but her own. I'd come to her as a stranger, had watched her transform from Ice Queen to genuine human, had fallen for her in ways that still surprise me when I examine them too closely. I believe we're proof of it. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Vivian called me with an idea that would change everything. I want to build something. Her voice carried an excitement I'd learned to associate with her best impulses. Not just restore or repair, but actually build from scratch. Something that matters. Something that helps people. What kind of something? A community workshop. A place where people can learn traditional crafts, woodworking and textile arts, and all the skills that are disappearing because everyone thinks technology makes them obsolete. A space where knowledge gets passed from one generation to the next, the way it used to before we decided efficiency was more important than wisdom. The vision hit me somewhere deep, somewhere connected to my father and everything he'd taught me about the value of working with your hands. Warren Thornton had spent his whole life trying to preserve exactly this kind of knowledge, had despaired in his final years about the fading respect for genuine craftsmanship. Where would you build it? Here, on the back portion of the property. There's enough space for a workshop building and room for expansion if it grows. You want to build a community center. I want to build a legacy, something that lasts beyond any of us. And I want to name it after the man who started all of this, even though he never knew what he was starting. The implication took a moment to land. You want to name it after my father, Warren Thornton Community Workshop? She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. He's the reason we met Garrett. His work at St. Andrews, the reputation he built, the values he passed down to you. Everything that brought us together traces back to him. It seems right that we honor that. I couldn't speak for several seconds, emotion closing my throat around words that wouldn't form. My father had died believing his craft was dying with him, that the world had moved on from everything he valued. The thought of his name attached to something designed to keep those traditions alive felt like a gift I hadn't known I needed to receive. He would have loved that. My voice came out rougher than I intended. He would have loved everything about it. Then help me build it, not as a contractor, as a partner. Your knowledge, my resources, our combined belief that what we're doing matters. Together, we can create something that changes how this community thinks about work and skill and the value of things that can't be measured in dollars. The planning took months, architectural consultations and zoning permits and all the bureaucratic complexity that comes with building anything substantial in the modern world. But the complexity was worth it because the vision was worth it, and working towards something meaningful with someone I loved made even the tedious parts feel purposeful. Colt joined the effort, contributing electrical expertise and the energy of someone who'd found his own reasons to believe in the project. He and Carrie had made their relationship official by then, a development that complicated family gatherings in ways that somehow made them richer rather than more difficult. Hank came on board for the plumbing, bringing with him a crew of contractors who shared our belief in the value of traditional skills. He'd been skeptical, at first unsure whether a community workshop could survive in a world obsessed with apps and algorithms, but Vivian's passion had won him over the way it had won over everyone who spent time in her orbit. The groundbreaking ceremony happened on a Saturday morning in late September, exactly 1 year after I'd first set foot on the Ashford estate and heard Vivian's whispered confession through the lavender. The timing felt significant, a full circle that connected past and present in ways that seemed almost designed. A small crowd had gathered for the occasion, friends and neighbors and representatives from local organizations that supported our mission. Dot stood near the refreshment table. She'd insisted on providing her presence a reminder of how far we'd all traveled from our starting points. Carrie held Colt's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, her expensive legal training apparently no barrier to appreciating a man who worked with his hands. Vivian stepped up to address the crowd, her voice carrying the confidence that had grown steadily since her liberation. She thanked people and acknowledged contributions and explained the vision in terms that made it feel both ambitious and achievable. But when she got to the naming, her composure wavered for the first time. This workshop will carry the name of Warren Thornton, a man I never met, but whose influence shaped everything that led me here. He spent his life believing that craftsmanship matters, that the work of our hands can be a form of prayer, that what we build outlasts who we are. His son Garrett carries that same belief, and together we want to create a space where future generations can discover it for themselves. She looked at me, then her eyes bright with emotion. A man's word should be as solid as his work. That's something Warren Thornton used to say. It's something his son has lived every day I've known him. And it's the principle that will guide everything we do here. The crowd applauded, and the moment passed, and we turned the first shovels of dirt and soil that would soon support something larger than any of us. But I stood there holding the shovel my father had used 30 years ago, the one I'd brought specifically for this occasion, and I felt his presence in a way I hadn't felt since his death. He was here, not literally, not physically, but in the values that had shaped me and the work that had brought me to this point, in the woman I loved and the son who was becoming a man I respected, in the community that was gathering around a vision of craft and integrity that he'd championed his whole life. The workshop took shape over the following months, rising from the Texas soil like a promise being kept. Stone walls and timber framing a metal roof that would outlast everyone who built it, spaces designed for teaching and learning, and the patient transmission of knowledge from one pair of hands to another. I did the woodwork myself, most of it spending long hours in the emerging building with tools my father had taught me to use. The physical labor felt like meditation, each joint and beam a conversation with materials that demanded honesty in return for cooperation. Wood didn't care about status or wealth or social position. It only responded to skill and patience and the willingness to understand its nature. Vivian learned to help her engineering background, providing frameworks for understanding why certain techniques worked, while her determination pushed her through the inevitable frustrations of mastering unfamiliar skills. She became competent with a hammer and chisel, not expert but capable, and the pride she took in contributing to the physical construction mattered more than the minor mistakes along the way. The grand opening drew a larger crowd than we'd anticipated, families and craftspeople and curious neighbors filling the workshop space that had felt cavernously empty just weeks before. Local newspapers sent reporters. The foundation board that had once sought Vivian's consultation now sent representatives to observe what she was building without their involvement. I watched from the back of the room as she addressed the gathering, her confidence fully settled, now her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned her place through struggle rather than inheritance. She explained the mission and the methods, the classes that would be offered, and the community that would form around shared learning. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She called me forward. "Before we open our doors, there's something I need to say." She reached for my hand as I joined her at the front. "This workshop exists because of a man who understood that some things matter more than money. That integrity isn't old-fashioned, it's essential. That the work of our hands can be sacred if we approach it with the right spirit." She turned to face me directly, ignoring the crowd entirely. "Garrett Thornton, you came into my life when I'd forgotten who I was. You showed me what genuine respect looks like. You taught me that age and circumstance don't determine who we can love or what we can become. And now you've helped me build something that will outlast both of us." The crowd had gone very quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. I felt exposed in a way that was simultaneously uncomfortable and exactly right. My father used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's deciding that something matters more than the fear. I've been afraid for most of my life, afraid of inadequacy and loneliness and not being enough for the people I loved. You've made me braver than I knew I could be." She released my hand and reached into her pocket, producing a small velvet box that made the crowd murmur with anticipation. "I know this isn't how these things usually go. I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask, supposed to be the one who gets proposed to rather than the one who proposes. But I've spent enough of my life waiting for permission to want what I want, so I'm asking." The box opened to reveal a ring, simple gold, with a small diamond that caught the afternoon light streaming through the workshop windows. "Garrett Thornton, will you marry me?" The moment stretched, every eye in the room fixed on us, every breath held in collective anticipation. I thought about my father and his regrets about the love he'd let go because fear seemed more sensible than faith. I thought about Linda and the years of happiness we'd shared before death reminded me that nothing lasts forever. I thought about Colt and Carrie, two young people who'd found their way back to each other despite everything that had pulled them apart. And I thought about Vivian, this remarkable woman who'd been brave enough to burn down her entire life in pursuit of something genuine. Who'd stood up to a man who'd tried to crush her and emerged stronger than she'd been before. Who'd taken my hand when I didn't know I was reaching and hadn't let go since. Yes, the word came out stronger than I expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted applause and cheering, filling the workshop space that would soon host the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. Vivian slipped the ring onto my finger, the metal cool against skin, still rough from the work of building this place. Then she kissed me right there in front of everyone, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care who was watching. The wedding was small, held 3 months later in the very workshop we'd built together. Colt stood as my witness, Carrie as Vivian's, the two of them flanking us like bookends to a story still being written. Hank officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, his usual humor subdued by the gravity of what he was being asked to do. Dot organized everything with the efficiency she'd developed over decades of managing impossible situations, transforming the workshop into something almost magical, with flowers and candles, and the kind of attention to detail that turns ordinary spaces into sacred ones. The guest list was deliberately limited, just the people who'd become important during this strange journey. No Ashford relatives, no society connections, no one from the world Vivian had escaped. Just honest people who'd earned their places through genuine care and support. My vows were simple promises of presence and partnership that I meant with everything in me. "I will stand with you when standing is hard. I will see you even when you feel invisible. I will build with you whatever life we choose to build, and I will repair whatever breaks along the way." Vivian's response matched my simplicity with her own directness. "I spent 32 years being exactly what someone else wanted me to be. With you, I've learned to be exactly who I am. I promise to keep becoming that person and to love whoever you keep becoming for as long as we have." Hank pronounced us married with characteristic understatement, his eyes suspiciously bright as we exchanged rings. Then Colt stepped forward with a toast that surprised everyone, including, I think, himself. "My grandfather believed that the best structures are the ones that can bend without breaking. That flexibility isn't weakness, it's wisdom." I didn't understand that until I watched my father and Vivian figure out how to be together despite everything that should have kept them apart. He raised his glass toward us, his expression carrying an emotion I couldn't quite name. To flexibility, to wisdom, and to the kind of love that bends around obstacles instead of breaking against them. The first classes at Warren Thornton Community Workshop began that spring. Small groups of students, ranging from teenagers to retirees, gathering to learn skills their grandparents had known, but their parents had forgotten. Vivian taught textile arts, drawing on knowledge she'd absorbed decades ago from her mother and grandmother. I taught woodworking, passing along techniques my father had passed to me. Hank offered plumbing basics that drew surprising crowds, his combination of practical wisdom and irreverent humor making him unexpectedly popular with students half his age. Colt started an electrical safety course that became the most subscribed program in our first year, his ability to make technical information accessible, proving exactly as valuable as I'd always known it was. Carrie handled the legal and administrative side, her expensive education finally serving purposes she actually believed in. She'd left her old firm and started her own practice, specializing in helping people navigate the same kinds of family law situations that had nearly destroyed her mother. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Carrie herself. Dot managed the workshop's daily operations with the same competence she'd brought to running the Ashford household, though she seemed considerably happier doing it for people who actually appreciated her efforts. She and Vivian had become something like family over these months, their partnership evolving from professional arrangement to genuine sisterhood. The community that formed around the workshop surprised everyone, including those of us who'd hoped for it most. People who had nothing in common except geographic proximity discovered shared interests in mutual respect through the act of learning together. Class barriers that seemed insurmountable in other contexts melted away in spaces where competence mattered more than credentials. 6 months after opening, we hosted our first community dinner, a potluck gathering that drew nearly 100 people to tables set up across the workshop floor. I stood at the edge of the crowd watching strangers become neighbors, watching the vision Vivian had articulated somehow manifest in exactly the way she'd imagined. She found me there, her hands slipping into mine with the easy familiarity of genuine partnership. Not bad for a grieving widower and an ice queen who didn't know she was frozen. Not bad at all. We watched our community celebrating itself, saw Colton Carey helping Dot distribute desserts, heard laughter echoing off walls we'd built with our own hands. The moment felt like a culmination, like a destination we'd been traveling toward without quite knowing it was there. My father used to tell me that a rich man is one who has enough. Not enough money or enough things, but enough peace, enough meaning, enough connection to the people and places that matter. Standing in that workshop with my wife's hand in mine and our shared community surrounding us, I finally understood what he meant. The wealth I'd accumulated wasn't measured in bank accounts or property deeds. It was measured in the quality of the life I was living, in the depth of the relationships I'd built, in the legacy I was helping to create. 1 year after that first community dinner, the workshop had grown beyond anything we'd originally imagined. Programs had multiplied, partnerships had formed with schools and social services. Organizations. The building itself had been expanded to accommodate demand. What started as one woman's vision had become something larger, a movement of sorts, a pushback against the disposability that seemed to define modern life. I was 55 by then, my hair showing more gray than brown, my hands still calloused from daily work. Vivian had celebrated her 61st birthday with characteristic resistance to anything resembling a fuss, though Dot had overridden her objections and thrown a party anyway. We'd settled into a rhythm, the two of us, the kind of comfortable partnership that comes from years of navigating life together. Not the passionate intensity of young love, but something deeper and more durable, the knowledge that whatever came next, we'd face it as a team. Colton Carey had married the previous spring, a ceremony even smaller than ours had been, just the immediate family and a few close friends. They were expecting their first child now, a development that made me feel simultaneously ancient and profoundly grateful for the continuation of something. The child would be born into a complicated family tree, grandparents on one side who'd found each other through circumstance stranger than fiction, a great-grandfather's legacy preserved in a building where she might someday learn to work with her hands. The thought of that continuity of Warren Thornton's values passing to generations he'd never meet felt like the best kind of immortality. One evening in late summer, Vivian and I sat on the porch of the Fredericksburg house watching the sun set over the hills. The view hadn't changed in the years we'd been there, the same limestone cliffs and scrub oak that had witnessed generations of Texas history. But I saw it differently now than I had before, saw it as context for a life I hadn't expected to have. If someone had told me 3 years ago that this is where I'd end up, I wouldn't have believed them. Vivian's voice was soft, contemplative. Divorced, remarried, running a community workshop with a man I met at my daughter's engagement party. It sounds like the plot of a bad novel. Sometimes real life is stranger than fiction. And better. She turned to look at me, her expression carrying an emotion I'd learned to recognize over our years together. I was so afraid, Garrett. For so long, I was so afraid of everything. Of being alone, of being judged, of discovering that the life I'd built was actually hollow. You didn't take the fear away, but you showed me it didn't have to control me. Your fear didn't control you. Your courage did. Courage I didn't know I had until you believed in it. I reached for her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. We sat together as the sky changed colors, as the day surrendered to evening, as the life we'd built together continued its patient unfolding. Somewhere in the house behind us, Dot was preparing dinner, while listening to a radio program she'd developed an inexplicable addiction to. Down the road at the workshop, volunteers were closing up after the day's classes. In Austin, the world continued its chaotic, spinning problems, and progress tangled together in ways that defied simple interpretation. But here in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Two people who'd found each other against improbable odds, building something that mattered from the wreckage of lives that had needed tearing down. 1 year before I started this story, I was standing in a garden at the Ashford estate, listening to a woman I didn't know say something she didn't mean for anyone to hear. I wish I had a man who talked to his son like that. The words had stayed with me, had drawn me toward her. Despite every sensible objection, had started a chain of events that led to everything that followed. I didn't know then what I know now, that sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive disguised as accidents, that the people who change us most often appear when we're not looking for them, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to act despite it. My father understood these things, I think, even if he couldn't always articulate them. He built his whole life around the idea that integrity and craftsmanship and honest effort matter more than their more glamorous alternatives. He passed that understanding to me, and I tried to pass it to Colt, and now we were all trying to pass it to the community that gathered in the workshop bearing his name. Late at night is never too late to start over, Warren Thornton used to say. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is right now. I was 52 when I planted the tree that became my life with Vivian. Older than most people start over younger than plenty of others who never get the chance. The timing felt significant and also irrelevant, a reminder that the calendar measures only one dimension of what it means to be alive. What matters isn't when you begin. What matters is that you begin at all. That you look at the life you've been living and find the courage to ask whether it's the life you actually want. That you listen when your heart tells you something is missing and you do something about the silence. Vivian taught me that in her way by doing it herself, by walking away from everything she'd known, because staying would have meant dying by inches, by taking my hand when I offered it and holding on through everything that followed. And now here we are, she and I in a restored house on land that holds her childhood memories, surrounded by a community we helped create and a family that defines itself by choice rather than blood. Not perfect, never perfect, but real in ways that matter more than perfection ever could. The stars came out as we sat there, the same stars my father had watched from this same hill country sky, the same stars that would continue burning long after all of us were gone. Vivian squeezed my hand and I squeezed back, and we let the silence speak for us. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges or joys the remaining years might hold, we would face them the way we'd faced everything else. Together. Honestly. With the kind of love that bends around obstacles instead of breaking against them. That's the story, I suppose. The whole improbable truth of how a grieving widower and a frozen society wife found each other in a garden and built something neither had dared to imagine. Not a fairy tale exactly, there's too much pain and complication for that. But maybe something better than a fairy tale. Something real. My name is Garrett Thornton, and I'm a carpenter, the son of Warren Thornton, the father of Colton Thornton, and the husband of a woman named Vivian, who saved my life without trying. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I know exactly who I am.